welcome. My name is Georgia Itaki. I'm Senior Lecturer in Media and Communication Studies here at the Karlstad University. And I am delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the Center for Geomedia Studies to the inaugural lecture of the 2025 Jubilee Under Visiting Professor, Annette Hill. Welcome, Annette.
Thank you so very much.
Annette is a professor in media and communication at Jönköping University. Her work focuses on media audiences with interests ranging from media engagement and citizenship to sustainable democracy, everyday life, genres, production studies, and viewing cultures. She's the author of 10 books and has published over 90 articles and book chapters across journals and edited anthologies. Her upcoming work includes 2 edited volumes, Media Imaginaries, coming out with Intellect this year, and Media Frictions, due next year from Routledge. Today, she will be speaking on the topic Imagining Infrastructures. After the lecture, there will be plenty of time for your comments, questions, and reflections. And we also invite you to join us for a mingle just outside. Before I hand over to Annette, I'd like to say a big thank you from the Center for Geomedia Studies to all of you for being here today, and to the Under Foundation for making this visiting professorship possible. Annette, welcome to our city, to Karlstad University, and to the Center for Geomedia Studies. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. What a lovely, warm introduction. Thank you to Geomedia, thank you to Georgia, and thank you to the Under Foundation for supporting this professorship. It's a joy to be a visiting professor. You get all the fun. You get to be treated so well, and you don't have to do the dishes or things like that at home. So it's a pleasure to come and see you in Karlstad. And I'd like to talk to you today about some new work. It connects to some discussions we've been having around methods and imaginaries and infrastructures with the Geomedia. But this is fresh work that I'd like to talk to you about today. And I'm going to use a combination of 3 recurring words, which is imagining, layering, and streaming. And I hope you'll see how I'm going to intertwine these words as I move along in the talk. So, a shout out also to Zaki Habibi, who did this beautiful photo for me to use here. How do we imagine infrastructures? I and 2 co-researchers, Neil and Long, have been working on a chapter for this particular edited collection, Media Imaginaries, and that arose out of a symposium that I ran when I was at Lund University, that some of you even presented at, around thinking about a playbook for media imaginaries. And in this particular work I'm going to talk to you about today, Neil and Long and I have been writing about how to use methods of drawing platform maps and reflective interviews. And the idea with the methods is to understand how images enable audiences to show what is on their minds when imagining their total streaming environment at this present time, and their agency in envisioning a future for a greener streaming. And I'd like now to talk through these terms, imagining, layering, and streaming with you. So I want to introduce the concept of layering into discussion of imagining streaming infrastructures. Research on imaginaries usually engages with Charles Taylor's foundational work on social imaginaries, focusing on institutional, technical, and human practices as material objects and symbols in society. And as the feminist author Deborah Chambers has written recently, Taylor's influence is evident in a scholarly focus on audience imaginaries as constituted by organizations who build infrastructures. In a special issue of a journal on digital infrastructures in 2019, the scholars there reflected on a growing body of work in what they called the study of digital infrastructures. But you'll note in that special issue an absence of connections between infrastructures and audiences. the people navigating the pipes and the platforms and the politics that the scholars refer to in that special issue. Debates concerning power relations between stakeholders and publics will inevitably imagine what audiences do or don't do, telling us more about institutional and corporate actors than audiences as civic actors. Instead, then, I want to turn to the cultural imaginary as a rich area to draw from. In early writings in the 1950s and 1960s, the French author Roland Barthes playfully imagined what an artifact might be, its potentiality as a resource, and what an artifact is, its existing meanings embedded in norms, values, and practices. Barthes wrote about the power of illusion, from reports on aliens at Mars, to high-wire trapeze acts, to professional wrestling. And in these essays, he was fascinated by a cultural imaginary as contrary, taking into account contrapositions and beliefs. He calls this kind of cultural imaginary contrary reality. And I think it's a term that's rich in meaning when attuning to audiences as they manage the contradictions in my case for the talk today, streaming content from platforms, which in turn are powered by global companies that negatively impact on the ecology of media and the environment. My main conceptual contribution of layering to cultural imaginaries, I want to argue today, is a means to make visible the shapes, directions, and contrapositions of audiences and infrastructures. With historical roots in Middle English, to layer means to form layers of a substance, for example, bricks, by someone who does the layering, the bricklayer. And these actions involve arranging substances to form something bigger, stronger, possibly more complex, a brick wall. And to layer also means to grow something. So when a plant has shoots or branches that root while still attached to the parent plant, then this is a form of propagation to grow new plants over time. It's another meaning of layering. Layering thus includes the formation of something, an architectural sense of layering for building. And this meaning of layering, I'm going to link in the talk to research by Brian Larkin, for example, on human technical ensembles for infrastructures. And the other sense of layering as new life connects with more creative layering of art and representations and imagination. And this meaning of layering, I'm going to link in the work today to the way audiences visualize and narrate infrastructures, drawing on the work of the artist and cultural scholar Robert Willem. Now to say something about the method. Drawing maps of platforms and reflecting on the images and meanings is something, first of all, that's been around for a very long time as a method, but secondly, that my team, and I'm going to give a shout out to this team, it's JC Lee in Canada, Long here in Sweden, and Nil in America. And together we've developed this method for transnational audiences, and we've done it in researching streaming Vietnamese indie music. We've done it in Southeast Asian streaming environments. And then in this talk, the empirical material arises from a small sample in Germany where we're growing the method and growing the analysis together. Now, when it comes to streaming, Germany has the second highest subscription rate, for example, to Netflix in Europe. And it's got estimates for streaming across Europe, which are increasing rapidly from 40 to 80% over the next couple of years. At the same time, Germany leads Europe in recycling initiatives, for example. And this dual story, this contraposition story of streaming businesses and green initiatives is significant to the talk today. there are contrapositions in the rapid rise of streaming platforms, the infrastructures to support the increased demand for data processing and energy consumption, and the harms caused to the Earth's atmosphere, for example, through water use or carbon emissions from data and energy centers. So there's a growing body of scientific and policy and public awareness of this issue, but it is still in its very early stages. Landmark books such as Maxwell and Miller's one called How Green Is Your Smartphone is one example, and that discusses the cost and harm of smartphones. And I guess the work I'm doing today aligns with this in the sense that I'm asking, how green is our streaming? Neil interviewed 14 persons who were long-term residents living in urban environments. A combination, around half were German citizens and half were transnational audiences. And they're primarily in the Gen Z age range of age 19 to 29. Most of these participants didn't have television set up in their apartments, and they associated the television set as a material object with family homes. Most of them opted to share accounts and reduce costs, sometimes through informal sharing platforms. And the reflective interviews contained an open thematic guide, including themes of the social side of streaming, household routines, and green routines, such as recycling. About halfway through the interview, that would last around an hour and 20 minutes, we asked them to draw a map of their streaming platform environments, giving participants the freedom to draw images and forms in whatever way they wanted to choose to do. We also asked them to reflect on the infrastructures, to characterize some of the infrastructures that enabled their streaming. And in such a way, the interior landscapes for streaming became external realities, with people asking themselves about material resources, where these are needed to provide the streaming content to them. So here you can see the map of maps. And we identified two patterns in these imaginary maps of streaming infrastructures. The first form is an example of Robert William calls depth infrastructures, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And that includes a meaning of layering in the architectural sense of the term. Streaming companies from the global north build upon, often layering on top of, national media infrastructures and related data and energy centers. The second form is an example of what we call organic infrastructures, and this term connects to the meaning of layering as a new life, imagery with a sense of growth and future thinking, similar to what Brian Larkin calls the promise of infrastructure, for example, in the form of sun, sea, and air. I now want to illustrate a depth infrastructure with the example of three of the maps, to show what we call big stream, a term we use to refer to the streaming giants of Netflix, YouTube, Amazon Prime, Disney, and Spotify. The streaming industry is, of course, as you know, connected to the digital economy dominated by big tech. And while the popular phrase, the streaming war, may suggest a competition, the reality behind the scenes tends to indicate that these different players are increasingly driving this industry towards a higher degree of monopolization. So, for example, Netflix and Disney Plus are two competitors who rely on the same cloud infrastructure of Amazon Web Services. As you can imagine, a vision of what Jennifer Holt calls in her book cloud policy can make these streaming giants appear hyper-visible in terms of their branding, but contrarily hidden in plain sight in terms of the infrastructures that support the brands. And that would be similar to other types of branding and infrastructures that we know from other disciplines. For Robert Willem, a depth infrastructure is a means of seeing the materialities of devices, use of power cables, data and energy centers, satellites, undersea cables, and other types of logistics. He developed this term in his wonderful book, Mundania. And Willem applies a cultural and artistic practice to digital infrastructures questioning the magical thinking behind devices that seemingly need little in the way of visible logistical support. He describes a depth infrastructure rather like a tower shape, a form that has a 360-degree perspective if standing at the top of the tower, looking around and about. And it also has a base structure that gives another type of perspective. So here is an illustration of platforms as city planning for business chains. There's one platform on every corner. For this female participant, Netflix and Co., to use her terms, are big world businesses. She reflected on her addiction to streaming and chose to draw her map in an urban environment using coffee, cakes, and drugs to represent commercial places for her entertainment fix. Netflix could be a coffee shop, she says, or bakery, because Netflix is present everywhere. And you see advertising, you see the slogan, Netflix and chill, so you hear it very often. So that's why I would say bakery, because in Germany we have lots of bakeries on all corners. And a prime could be a pharmacy. We have also so many pharmacies. And prime advertising on bus stops, I see them more than Netflix. So yeah, pharmacies. The prominence of Netflix and prime advertising is underscored by the jagged lines connecting the two businesses uptown on the map. The streets from both platform providers go downtown to Disney, highlighting commercial foot traffic between the three chains. Set to one side on another part of the map is newcomer Mubi, a British-based streaming company. There are no lines linking this regional provider with the global chains of Netflix and Co. Another map is visualized as center-periphery forms made by this 24-year-old female, the YouTube line. Now, Chalabi has talked about global value chain theory to differentiate the streaming landscape as divided between what he calls Class A streaming services operated by big tech and big stream, and Class B streaming services comprised mainly of traditional media and entertainment companies. And in this map, for example, Big Stream demarcates Class A streaming services, aggressively overlaying public service and other national streaming services. And when drawing the map, YouTube is all around. Netflix has a central position, and the public service providers are off a beaten track. They explained, I don't know if you can see it, but there are little dots coming from the YouTube line. So they follow you everywhere. So wherever you go, you always have YouTube in your mind. Yeah, YouTube is following you everywhere around. And then the biggest space that is taken is Netflix. It's pretty much down in the middle. It is in the center. It is huge. Down here is Disney Plus, yeah. And then you can see where the dots get a little bit bigger, yeah. And here, all the way down in a small, narrow alley, this is where you, if you really, really, really want to go down here, you find state TV. You know, if you really, really want to watch something, yeah. And you have to go down this little alleyway. And then that means you actually really want to watch something, because otherwise you won't ever find your way there. Not only are Class B streaming services, to use the phrase by Chalabi, positioned down in an alleyway, far away from the biggest spaces, but they are also classified as old-fashioned entertainment. And they, for example, say they're very conservative public service media. Sometimes it reminds me of theatre, where they try to pronounce every letter a little bit too much, which you would never do in normal life. Class A services, in their opinion, are more chilled and relaxed, a bit more real. The dots in this map are representative of the agency of this audience member and their perspective of a depth infrastructure. The dots are smaller in size when related to the YouTube line, giving a sense of the domestication of this platform, a mundane routine that's almost rendered invisible in the process. The dots get bigger when you go off the YouTube line to find Public Service Alley. Bigger dots mean actively choosing to occasionally go to these spaces to watch sports or news, for example. The YouTube line is a metaphor for easy access to a streaming service that's connected to a communication system. And according to Chalabi, the mechanisms become visible when taking a top-down view of the production of Class A and B streaming, according to a political economic perspective. However, this audience perspective, we're seeing the depth infrastructures like the YouTube line give this audience perspective of the production network and value chain. Note the way the depth infrastructure encircles those who use it. So they shift from mobile traveler hopping on and off the line to being followed by a neuromancer like YouTube, its algorithm everywhere around. The recurrence of grid systems in various maps, coupled with a critical reflection on global capitalism in the interviews, and a worry about the political actors involved in Silicon Valley and big tech, underscore this dark imagery of an infrastructure consumer matrix. The "You Are Here" in Platform Matrix map illustrates how this audience member imagined streaming platforms as an urban environment. What's evident here is the layering of the technical and lifestyle ensembles, positioning daily routes within the platform matrix system that they draw. Once again, a dot represents human agency in the infrastructure. The way the dot is a small spot on the urban grid also signals their feeling of being part of a depth infrastructure. So they say, so right in front of the dots, like go-to places I would stay for only a short period of time, I put YouTube and Spotify. Because I had a half an hour where I had nothing to do, this would be the place I would search for streaming something. There, on the map, I put Prime and Netflix, because if I wanted to watch a movie or a series, this would be the one I would first look up. After that, on the same row, but further down, I put Disney+, because if I couldn't find something on Netflix or Prime, I'd maybe watch it there. Yeah? And then I put some other random streaming platforms like HBO, Hulu, or maybe TV Now, not places I regularly visit. I would put on a VPN and would watch that online. Instead of referencing cyberpunk, this audience member described the main actors in their map using the analogy of feudalism in the streaming television series Game of Thrones. I think Netflix would be like someone of the Starks. They're user-friendly. Prime might be some of the Lannisters, really powerful and have a lot of influence, but something isn't right there. The YouTube is way more powerful than Spotify. Maybe Baratheon, because they are definitely one of the main forces, but it's hard to decide if they're evil or not. And Spotify will be one of the lower families. The depth of the infrastructure is given an emotional character with reflections on platform power games. For example, in discussing tracking and personalization, they commented, "I think Amazon is an evil company, so I'll probably stop membership. I have a shady feeling about them." The dot that represents "You Are Here" may be small in terms of spatial relations with the infrastructures for big stream, but it is a moving dot. One of the obstacles in imagining infrastructures is a lack of awareness regarding where power comes from for digital devices and what power streaming companies and audiences have in these settings. And this lack of awareness is partly down to the typical black box strategies and obfuscation of the companies associated with big tech and what we call big stream. And whilst there's an audience understanding of corporate power dynamics, a la Game of Thrones, or visualized as company chains or center periphery streaming houses, There is an absence of material power in the maps and in the discussions in the interviews. As this audience member noted, streaming sites offer immense services and need a lot of electricity, but I don't actually know what the energy with these streaming platforms take. YouTube and Amazon have a lot, yeah, they're not that eco-friendly. The "you are here" dot signifies how depth infrastructures offer perspectives on a Roland Barthes idea of contrary realities. The towering forms are the different houses for streaming companies: House of Netflix, House of Prime. And they are built to obscure deliberately from public view the material resources required for streaming and other energy-intensive applications such as in gaming or generative AI. A second pattern in the maps is what we call organic infrastructures. And this has an affinity with the way participants question how their streaming routines may potentially have an impact on the environment. There is an epistemic challenge of connecting environmental values to platforms and their global value chains. And as Maxwell, a scholar who's written in eco-media studies, has said, we cannot install exhaust pipes to smartphones. So at present, the traditional industrial imaginaries of pollution, for example, how much CO2 an hour of streaming produces, tends to dominate research within eco-media studies and sustainable communication. But to focus solely on carbon emissions, as other scholars have mentioned, for example, Laura Marks in Canada, sidesteps the difference between intangible digital media and tangible infrastructural resources. I would argue it also sidesteps the role of audiences in imagining the pollution from dirty streaming. So in this map, the participant represents themselves and their daily routines with a house of streaming set against the backdrop of day and night time. I've put a sun and moon, which should illustrate my day, starting with Spotify, YouTube. Scale matters in the sense that the platforms that are bigger are more important. And similar to the previous maps, where we found a hierarchy of streaming services, Class A and Class B, the global platforms of big stream are closer to home, and national and cable television are farther away. But unlike depth infrastructures, which enclose audiences within a grid network or a maze feeling, this map has a more open feel to it, including organic forms. The imagery opens up for a discussion of environmental matters in the interview. For example, this participant reflected, Amazon is a huge company which makes earnings through their logistics and other finances. They're definitely not green. And other companies, like even using so much internet, requires much electricity, which means that your carbon footprint couldn't be that good. Honestly, it doesn't matter which streaming platform you use. If you include Instagram and WhatsApp as well, it requires a battery, and the electricity doesn't come from renewable energy. That's why it can't be green. The sun and moon platforms suggest warm, domestic relations for this audience member and their streaming choices. And at the same time, reflections on material resources like batteries begin to challenge the myth of digital domesticity with the reality of the logistics that support a huge company like Amazon, which is definitely not green. This next map is another kind of organic infrastructure as imagined by this 26-year-old who also is active in the Green Party. They say, so the idea is, I am the boat. Spotify would be the safe haven. This almost mainland beach place. I think that Disney is a place you would sail to occasionally. I think HBO is a place that is currently the most appealing one. And then Netflix and YouTube, you have these rocks around them. So they're dangerous territories. I think Netflix produces a lot of trash. And YouTube. I'm not a fan of Reels of TikTok, and I think YouTube goes in that direction a lot. Then the prime one has a little mermaid. And I mean, in sailor terms, mermaids are appealing, but then they will eventually lead to your death. I guess. Yeah. It's the archipelago of streaming. No longer a dot in the urban grid system, this participant sails in their own archipelago of streaming. I am the boat, they say. The spatial relations illustrate the daily experiences, routinely landing on the Spotify beach for a spot of relaxation, sailing to the HBO island complete with palm tree. But overlaid on top of the spatial and lifestyle aspects of the map, there lies a critical perspective. The rocks around Netflix and YouTube are dangerous territories because of poor quality content and algorithmic power. Amazon as a mermaid lures audiences with deadly consequences. This participant went on to explain, I guess there's a very capitalist logic. So they have a lot of streaming services out there, but sooner or later, some of the smaller islands will have various rising water levels. I don't think that in 10 years' time, we will have all of the streaming services. For example, Amazon is probably going to swallow a smaller one. Probably Disney was going to swallow one as well. The reference to water levels rising or the drawing of clouds on the horizon is an indication of bad weather ahead. And in this imagining, global streaming companies will become even more voracious as large companies swallow smaller ones. For this person, platforms are not very green, as they say. I think that the fact that some of it needs to be uploaded somewhere and then downloaded somewhere and the device is using them, I think that there's a huge energy requirement for streaming services to function the way they do. Yeah, I think that's my perception of them. I would not say that they're environmentally friendly. I guess running a data center is very intense and it requires a lot of, I don't know, maybe water and cooling as well or something like that. Imagining what material resources are needed to run data centers is difficult to articulate. I think, I guess, I don't know. And just as scholars in eco-media studies have pointed out, audiences do struggle with the indeterminate form of platforms and environmental harm. This same person says, I think it's too convenient, and it's also very abstract. So the fact that there are so many layers in between where the climate harming aspect of it comes in, I don't know. I plug in my laptop charger and then I receive the Wi-Fi to the laptop. I think it's too abstract. I mean, for me, definitely it's too abstract. Repetition of this word abstract underscores the problem of imagining beyond so many layers of obfuscation between devices, big stream, and environmental harm. And yet this participant does identify ways to layer other images on top of their original drawing, and they start to imagine, I'd probably showcase pollution through polluted water. And maybe because I put the palm trees on HBO and Spotify, I would show dead trees. In the last map I want to discuss in the talk, the environmental elements take the form of pathways and footprints around the island of Australia. This person says, so basically, the Gold Coast and Tasmania is kind of the things I usually engage in. And if I take a long detour into Star Wars, or maybe a Marvel series, I would take the long ride to Perth, aka Disney, to watch them, or the other way around if I'm bored with the stuff on Netflix. And there's something good on Amazon. I take the long ride up to Darwin to do that. It's a surprisingly visible way, they say, talking about their map. I think the interconnection between Spotify and Instagram is the strongest because I'm on Spotify somewhere. I usually maybe also on Instagram answering messages or something. So that is like the most heavily traveled area, they say. By adapting their experience of traveling, this person imagines streaming routines in relation to scale and mobility. The broken lines indicate a concentration of streaming around the Gold Coast and Tasmania for everyday music and social media activities, represented spatially as south of their streaming island. They take a longer journey to watch favourite series and films to the west of the island, and on occasion take the long ride up to the north for special content on Prime. The relations between their platform travelling and the environment are, in their words, hard to imagine. It's easy to think of green activities in other ways, such as reducing carbon footprints by avoiding fast fashion, keeping the lights off at work, or turning the heating down at home. She says, "I try to keep my feet very small." And whilst they're aware that the climate crisis is severe, it's a big leap to see the infrastructure for their streaming and then do something about environmental harms. They explain, "I mean, in the end, it doesn't get there magically. It's not saved on my computer. It has to be saved on another computer. So someone basically just outsourced that part for me. I mean, I would be naive to think that most of server buildings have that. So that would probably be powered by power plants, whatever they use, like coal, oil, or wind turbines, solar power, nuclear power. But since they use a lot of energy, of course, the impact would be higher than a normal city. I think energy density for servers is higher than residential areas, way higher. So I think streaming, and especially if there's so many more streaming platforms popping up, you just have a lot of server infrastructure consuming a lot of energy, so it's not particularly sustainable. By drawing their streaming as a platform traveling map, it's possible to become aware of their spatial and environmental relations with Big Stream. It is a surprisingly visible way, they say. They imagine footprinting, not solely for carbon emissions, not solely for eco-footprinting, but also for social footprinting and cultural footprinting. And they imagine their relations with infrastructures and the environment. And in conclusion, by focusing on layering as a concept, I hope this talk offers a protean way of researching spatial and environmental relations for infrastructures. Major obstacles for imagining infrastructures concern abstract forms, where data centers, power plants, or undersea cables are hidden in plain sight, so taken for granted that it is hard to see these infrastructures and connect the materialities of power, electrical sockets and batteries, with the systemic power of tech giants, big tech and big stream. To move such obstacles takes major work regarding regulation, political economics, and environmental campaigns surrounding a digital green transition. But before moving the obstacles and opposing corporations' unsustainable practices, there is the process of seeing these obstacles and imagining an alternative of greener streaming. The explorations of maps and storytelling may, we hope, encourage further research on understanding what part people can play, I am the archipelago of streaming, in imagining and reimagining ecologies, infrastructures, and the environment. Thank you.